Let me talk a little bit about what I want to get out of this session today with you. We're not, unfortunately, going to be able to dive into actual scenario generation like we would in a workshop. That would take a little bit longer, and of course, it's very specific to your business. But instead, what I want to do is I want to kind of talk a little bit about scenario planning and in general, and why in particular that's very important right now. So what I want to do is I want to make a couple of points here. One is I want you to understand that at any point in time, there isn't just one future that's out there that will materialize, but there are actually several futures that are possible. And that really is the essence of scenario planning, is accepting this idea that alternatives are possible. And so we need to be thinking about what the realistic alternatives are so we can make better plans today. And then the second thing I want to drive home is the idea that, yes, we're in the virus crisis now. And of course, that's changed a lot of things for us in terms of the way we have to do business and even the way we live our lives. But the day will arrive, God willing, that the virus will be beaten. But when that happens, it doesn't mean that we're going to go back in time to the way things were before. In some respects, we probably will, but there might be some kind of a new normal, which will be the new permanent landscape that we have to be operating in. Why? Well, that's because during this COVID period, we've all been forced to rethink a lot of the things that we've been doing, a lot of things we've been taking for granted. And we've had to find new ways to do some things, invent some new ways. I mean, look at us now. We would not normally do a workshop or a presentation this way. But the fact that we actually are spending time reinventing some of the things in this new environment means that we are also seeing that some things actually work pretty well, and maybe they will become part of the new landscape going forward. But we don't know for sure, and so they become part of the alternative landscapes that we'll be thinking about. So we'll have to accept the idea that, yes, in the future, things are going to be different, but how will they be different? And that's the classic question of scenario planning, is to try to suss that out. And finally, I just want to convince you that scenario planning is really a valuable tool. And so it's about foreseeing specific strategic terrains. When I say foresee, it doesn't necessarily mean predicting them, but understanding how they might take shape and what they would mean for you. And then one last objective is kind of almost an emotional thing, is I just want to open your eyes to a new way to think about the future. Because a lot of people think about the future in classic conventional ways. Let me show you what I mean. They would believe, for example, that as 2019 began, it was a normal year like any other. The future was going to unfold the way they would always expect it to. But then, of course, we had this situation. No one saw this huge freight train, barreling down the tracks at us. And so 2020 has turned out to be a year that's very different. The question then is, will we really be going back in time to 2019? I think some people, want that to happen. They hope that it will happen. They wish that it would happen. But in my personal opinion, it ain't going to happen. We are not going to go back to 2019, except in certain, details. Obviously, not everything is going to change. What we want to do is we want to think about what it is that might be permanently changed, a new part of your permanent landscape. So, a lot of people in business think about the future in, I would just say, two sort of broad ways, and both of them are actually very misleading. Let me show you what they are. The first is, and we can thank Hollywood for this basically, but they think about the future in sort of science fiction terms. Now, I'm a victim of this just like anybody. When I think about the future, people think about flying cars and going on holiday to the moon and I don't know, having all the world's books in the pill form or all these funny things like that. And that's great, but it's a fantasy. And those kind of fantasy views of the future are not at all helpful for us in business. So it's great, Saturday night, go to the movies, sit and allow yourself to be immersed in a view of the future that's pure science fiction, pure fantasy. It's fun, but of course, from our point of view as decision makers, thinking about what we have to do to make our organization successful in the future, totally useless. Now, the second way people have a tendency to think of the future is as if the road to the future is just a long straight line like you see here. And the idea that they convince themselves of is that by standing at this roadhead and looking at in the direction that they're headed, that they can actually see on the horizon where they're going. And it's whether that's 1 year in the future or 10 years in the future, they still believe that they can clearly see what's at the end of the road for them. And this is a fallacy, a very risky fallacy, because it might lull you into a false sense of security that you actually know what's going to is awaiting you in the future, and you might be surprised that when you get to the future, it's not quite what you expected. We're going to talk about that in more detail in a minute. So this is a second way that a lot of people look at the future, also wrong. And if anything, what I want to do is I want to get the point across today that we need to find a more structured way to think about how the future could really realistically unfold. So how do we do that? Well, we hopefully use a technique called scenario planning. Scenario planning in our case, where we are right now in the year 2020, could actually be applied in two different phases. First is, as the crisis continues, the landscape is changing. The landscape is changing because of the crisis, and the question then would be, how long will it go on? How long will we be in this particular landscape? And how could it continue to evolve? But then, maybe a more important thing for us to think about, obviously the first step here during the crisis is really important because it has to do with, with survival. And everybody's kind of, pulling their heads in and making sure that they can get through this period. So I'm not saying that it's not important at all, but with, God willing, it will only be a short phase that we have to act in this way, and that what will happen afterward will be some kind of a post-coronavirus landscape. What will that be like? We don't know, but it might be with us for quite some time. So that once we emerge from the crisis, we might find out that the new landscape that's taking shape, and it's taking shape under our noses right now, but that new landscape, which will be our operating and strategic terrain, could be the terrain that we really have to succeed in for the next few years. Now, obviously, it will continue to evolve just like terrain always does. But when we start out, we're going to start out in a terrain that's been stamped very clearly by this coronavirus crisis period. And so we would want to figure out, when we emerge into this new landscape, what could it be like for our business? Now, I add the letter S to the word landscape here because, remember, scenario planning is about visualizing alternatives. And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that at any one point in time, there's more than one future that's possible. So with scenario planning as well, we're going to be trying to think of what are the new possible landscapes that might unfold. So this is where we're going to focus today, is on the new normal. All right, the post-virus landscape. Now, let me go back to this idea of the long straight road and look to sort of explain it to you as a schematic diagram rather than just showing you the photo of the road. This is how that thinking actually plays out. First of all, people say, okay, well, here we are, we're at the roadhead. This is this year, and they know where they've come from, which is the recent past, and can see the road behind them, let's say. And the most logical thing in the world is to just assume that the road continues in the same direction, or in other words, that all the variables that determine in their minds what the future will be like can simply be extrapolated into the future. So this is the way that a lot of people would mentally think about the future. And of course, it is not. It's very misleading. It's potentially dangerous, actually. Now, to be fair, nobody is quite this simple about it. What they do instead is they say, well, if the road continues in a straight line, we will end up in this place that we're going to call the most likely scenario. Now, actually, it's not a scenario at all. It's just the end point of the long straight road of the, it's just where the numbers tell you you will be if all you do is extrapolate the numbers. But then, of course, to be thorough, at least in their minds, what they do is they go back and they tweak the variables and they make, the exchange rates and the interest rates and the growth rates and all these things a little bit more favorable to them, just on the assumption that things might turn out a little bit better. They rerun the numbers. Lo and behold, they actually see that there is an outcome which is mathematically better than this so-called most likely case, and they call that the best case scenario. Then, of course, they do the same thing, and they make the numbers a little bit less favorable for them, and they end up with a new endpoint, and they call that the worst case scenario. So they believe that somehow we will end up somewhere in between the best and the worst case, which, think about it, you can't get any better than the best and you can't get any worse than the worst. So you really do believe that you will end up somewhere in between these endpoints, up or down. So that's a little bit like saying, well, yes, if everything just goes according to the way it is now, we'll end up here at the end of the long straight road, our extrapolated most likely scenario. But if things work out really well for us and the best case scenario takes place or materializes, we'll end up over here. And if the worst case scenario materializes, well, we'll end up over here. And therefore, the range of possibilities for us in the future is really, there it is. We can see it. We can still see the landscape. We just know that we're going to be off to one side or the other a little bit, depending on how some of the variables might actually change over time. Now, obviously I've simplified this entire thought process quite a lot just to sort of show it on a slide like this. But you can imagine that what's happened is that a manager who thinks like this still believes, I can see where we're going. This is, I can plan for it. That's the other thing. I can make decisions based on my knowledge that we're going into that landscape. We might be a little bit on the left, a little bit on the right, but basically this is where we're going to end up. And so that's very tempting to convince yourself, I've got it all under control. I know where we're going. But look what really happens as time goes by. You have all kinds of things that happen in your landscape that are not really quantifiable in the sense of tweaking a number like an exchange rate or an interest rate or something like that. And all of these kinds of developments or trends, and here you see only a few. I mean, I could put probably dozens and dozens of these possible factors on this chart. Each one of them will have a tendency to bend the long road that we're on. And of course, the coronavirus is kind of the granddaddy of all big changes. And it has bent the road that we're on completely. And what happens is, as you're going down this road and these kinds of things all happen, the road gets starts taking some twists and turns, and you end up not in the landscape where you expected to be, where you actually thought you could see, but in fact, you end up in an entirely new landscape altogether. Now, normally, scenario planning, which aims to try to foresee these landscapes, is looking ahead 8 to 10 years. But we're in a situation now with the COVID upon us that basically this new landscape is forming under our noses, and we actually will emerge into some kind of a new landscape probably within the next year or so. So everything is compressed, and instead of looking 8 or 10 years in the future, we're really talking about a matter of months rather than years. Now, here's another schematic way of kind of looking at where we are now. We're in this big screaming red zone, obviously. And as long as we're in this red zone, the natural tendency for a board or a executive team is to think about the current situation. How bad could it get? And what do the changes that we've been experiencing, what do they mean for our company and our success? And of course, as time goes on, people are realizing, okay, we can master the current situation. We've made the operational changes that we need to make. Let's start thinking a little bit about the future. And for them, the future looks like this blue area here, which is some kind of post-corona landscape. And they think about it as being the future, right? And they're saying, what could this landscape mean for the future success of our organization? But don't forget, in scenario planning, it's not about the future or the landscape, but actually what could the landscapes be like out here? Because this is actually what we're talking about. We're talking about the idea that right now in this red zone where we are all struggling a bit, when we look ahead, we don't know which one of these blue paths will actually represent the terrain, the landscape that we will find ourselves in, that we will have to adapt to, that we will have to thrive in. Now, scenario planning is a way to deal with this uncertainty. It asks this basic question: what could the landscapes look like? Well, and you'll note here landscapes, because we're talking about alternatives and not trying to say that there will only be one landscape out there and that's the one that we will definitely be in. And then there's this word could, because we're not trying to predict. We're not saying what will the landscapes look like, because nobody really knows. It would be wonderful if we all had a crystal ball and knew what the landscapes would look like, but then we would probably all be retired and living off of our casino earnings. So we're not trying to predict, but we're trying to explore realistic possibilities. So how do you do that? Now I want to walk you through the process here. This is a little bit of an abbreviated version, but I think you'll see the logic of the process here, and you'll appreciate that this gives you a really solid way to think about how the future could unfold. The first thing you want to do is identify what I call driving forces, and sometimes these are called drivers for change, or just drivers. There's a lot of different terms out there. Basically, a driving force is anything, big or small, that could have some kind of an impact on our future success. Now, let me give you an example here. Let's imagine that we ran a boutique hotel in some faraway place on an exotic island surrounded by a tropical sea. Sounds great, right? But one of the things that we are definitely subject to in our boutique hotel is something called airlift. So airlift would be one of the driving forces which would be very critical to our future success. Why? Because, well, if the airlines decide that they're not going to fly 5 flights a week to our island, but rather only 2, that could actually have an impact on our business, obviously. Now, the thing is, when we're talking about figuring out what the driving forces are that would affect our business, we want to also at least give some thought to what are the driving forces that are kind of behind the driving forces, right? So by that, I mean the airlines who make decisions on whether or not there will be 5 flights a week or only 2, or whether or not there will be big planes full of people or only small planes bringing a few people to our exotic island. They don't make those decisions just on a whim. They actually make those decisions based on demand. And so what would be a factor that could affect demand? Well, one of the obvious ones would be the price of the ticket to this island, right? The only people who ever come to our hotel get there by air. Nobody arrives, nobody swims there. So everybody arrives by air. And if the ticket prices are suddenly too high, people might say, well, why don't we go and take our holiday somewhere it's a little bit more affordable? We can't really afford to go there. So what would be some factors that would be behind the driving force of airlift? And there would be many, but one of them could be the price of oil. And as we've seen in the past, when the price of oil was very high, and I think it hit almost 150 US dollars a barrel within the last decade, what do the airlines do? Well, they tack on some kind of a fuel supplement, they call it. They want you to see that they're blaming it on the oil industry rather than on themselves. But basically, it adds quite a lot to the price of a ticket. And so even though right now oil is quite cheap, if it would become expensive again, which is not out of the realm of possibility since it has been there before, then the ticket price for our potential guests at our hotel could get so high that they decide that they're not going to come, or rather than even deciding about the hotel, simply they say we can't afford to fly. In that case, then the airlines would not be able to fill up their planes, and then they would cut back the number of planes that they are flying to our island, and that would have an impact on us. So you see, indirectly, the price of oil is a factor for our hotel, and it's probably something we would want to keep an eye on and note, at least mentally note, that if the price of oil looks like it's going higher and higher and higher, to think, well, I wonder at what point we might actually start seeing an impact on flights and therefore on us. Now, if you wanted to, you could actually then say, well, yes, that's great, but what driving force is behind the driving force of oil prices? So one of the factors of many would be the rise in demand for gasoline in China, which has millions more cars registered than it did a decade ago, and with no end in sight as to the urbanization that's going on there. But then you start asking yourself, well, if we see the urbanization in China as some kind of an impact on our hotel on an exotic island, it's too tenuous, and we don't really need to think about those things. But the chain of causality, you can actually move it as far back as you want to, and you will probably want to go at least a couple steps back. So, for example, if you saw as a hotelier, if you saw that there was an issue with the price of oil going up and up, you might actually scratch your head and say, we might want to think about what we would do if we start to see airlift being affected by that. Now, in the scenario planning brotherhood, we actually divide these driving forces into 4 categories. Just makes it easier to think of. And we use this so-called PEST model, which is based on these 4 categories. Sometimes you'll see this written in a different way. There are some alternatives that you've seen, perhaps STEEP, which is STEEP, and that introduces a 5th category, which is environmental change. But environmental change is very interesting to think about for the longer term. But if we're talking about a new environment, a new business terrain emerging within the next 12 to 18 months or something like that, I think environmental change is probably not going to be a factor that will have a huge impact on that. Going forward, the next decade, yes, perhaps, but we kind of leave it out here. Sometimes you'll also see the PESTL, which is PEST plus also the environment, but an L added for legal changes. And in my opinion, legal changes can also sort of be folded into political changes, since it's the politicians who pass the laws in the first place. So there we are. Now, what happens is, in a workshop, if I were to work with you, for example, and we would set aside a few hours to try to come up with scenarios for your post-COVID terrain, we would spend probably 45 minutes to an hour trying to come up with as many driving forces as possible that could have an impact on the bank. And it's very common in most of the workshops that I've actually facilitated that you would end up after really an hour or even a little bit less with 100, maybe 150 driving forces. So some of them are clearly not very important because they're small, they don't have a huge impact, but they are a driving force in some respect. Others are, of course, much more important. And what we need to do in the next phase of the process is we need to determine which of those driving forces are really the ones that are the most important for our future. And what we're doing is we're looking for things that are called critical uncertainties. And just as you can tell from the name, a critical uncertainty has 2 defining characteristics. The first is it's critical, and the second one is that it is uncertain. And by that, I mean that it's a driving force, which we would have identified in the previous step of the process, but it is one that could have a very big effect on our future. But as of right now, we don't know which way it's going to go. So it's really uncertain. And what we have to do in this process is we have to choose from this huge array of driving forces. The process forces us to choose two, only two, which really are the most critical uncertainties for our future. And I'll show you why in a moment here. Once we have selected two, which we believe are the ones that would have the greatest potential impact on our future, but at the same time are unknown to us as to which way they might actually go, we make an assumption. We make an assumption that in the future, when the scenarios materialize, and for us, this is going to be sort of 18 months from now, right? We're talking about pretty near term rather than a decade from now, that either these critical uncertainties will resolve themselves in one direction or its exact opposite. Now, in reality, we know that things don't always go in one extreme or the other. There's a lot of things that kind of turn out to be in the mushy middle. Lots of shades of gray in the world, right? Nothing is ever 100% black, 100% white. However, one of the purposes of scenario planning is to illustrate how different the future might be for us. So what we want to do is we want to introduce an element of contrast between the scenarios, even if we have to be a little bit artificial by doing that, if we have to exaggerate the endpoints a little bit. Let me show you what I mean here. Here's some examples from scenario workshops that I've done recently. So we're trying to imagine that the outcomes of these uncertainties would be contrasting. So in the case of something like access to capital, either we would have an easy money environment or a tight money environment. So in the easy money environment, lending is easy to come by, investors are thick on the ground. If we have a project, for example, that we're trying to finance, it's not hard for us to actually raise that capital. Or it could be that because interest rates are very high, or we don't qualify for loans, or for whatever reason, getting that finance raised is going to be very difficult. We're talking about a tight money environment. And in reality, we might be somewhere in between these two endpoints, but in order for us to really foresee how different the future might be, we're going to assume that we're either going to be in an easy money environment or a tight money environment. Second example, this is from a few years ago, Brexit. Well, if you were doing business with the UK, for example, and you knew that there was this huge referendum coming up, you actually, before the referendum took place, if you looked at the surveys, they were really close to 50-50. So it was very classically uncertain, and you have only two outcomes. One was that they would leave, Brexit would be successful, or the second would be that they would vote to remain within the EU. And of course, the consequences of those two things could be enormous depending on your business. And so this is probably the most classic critical uncertainty you could imagine. Take something that's a little bit more, let's say, psychological based rather than pure business, and that's the attitude towards you of the media. Well, they could either be very friendly or they could be very antagonistic, and that could have an income on your reputation. That could have an outcome on your ability to attract customers, and all kinds of things. So obviously you could influence this in some way, you would want to try to influence it, but sometimes the attitude of the media is something that you just have to kind of deal with, and it can be either friendly or it could be antagonistic. In reality, there will be a little of each probably, depending on the actual journalists we're talking about. But if you talk about the media as a whole, the contrast that you're looking for here is that they're either on your side or they're not on your side. And then the last two I'll show come from the oil exploration business, and they actually believed that the two critical uncertainties facing them had to do with whether or not in the future, and this for them, the future meant 10 years in the future, the fossil fuels would still be the base for most energy consumption, or maybe renewables would have not displaced completely fossil fuels, but it would be more of the center of gravity would have definitely moved towards renewables. And the second critical uncertainty that they thought had to do with the regulatory environment, the regulatory regime that they would have to deal with in terms of particularly the environmental regulations, because they're basically drilling for oil, undersea drilling. So what they do now, or this is the next step of the process, is we actually, based on this either or assumption, we take, just go back here, we take our nice blue arrows that you see here, which represent a contrast between one outcome and another of the critical uncertainties, and we use those arrows to create a matrix, and we say that, okay, in the first critical uncertainty that we are choosing, it has to do with the regulations. Either they're going to be very tight, very hard, or they're going to be a little bit more relaxed in the future, as we just mentioned. The second one is going to be about whether the energy focus is going to be fossil fuel oriented or renewable oriented. And actually, depending on which combination of these uncertainties actually become reality over a decade, we would find ourselves in a completely different business landscape. Each one of these, if you think about it, would be very different for an oil exploration company, and they would have to operate in a different way. They would have different priorities. They would have to deal with different challenges, which we'll come to in a moment. But you can see that the landscapes are not the same in these four different scenarios. Are they realistic, these scenarios? Yes. Why? Because they depend, they're built on the basis of critical uncertainties, on make or break aspects of their future business, and which at the same time right now are unknown to them as to how they'll turn out. It's the uncertainty that's the really important thing to understand here. If something is uncertain to you right now, then maybe you need to account for that uncertainty to be resolved in more than one way. Because if you just say, oh, well, it's uncertain, but we'll only plan for it to resolve itself like this, you've made a prediction, you've made a bet, actually, which is maybe not a wise bet. You might be better off to plan for that uncertainty to resolve itself in either of the two different ways. Now, we go back here, if you just stopped here and you said, okay, great, we've now identified four scenarios, and you could stop here, but basically all you've done is you've kind of created a skeleton, which can be useful, can be a little bit eye-opening, but to be very useful, what you want to do is you want to actually put meat on those bones. And what I mean by that is you want to describe the four scenarios in some detail. And so in the case of this oil exploration company, and I'm not going to bore you with these details here, but basically what they said was, for each of the four scenarios, let's try to suss out what we believe would characterize that business terrain for us in both positive characteristics and negative characteristics. So you can see here a few examples. And some of these are conjecture. So for example, if you see the second one here on the left, it says 5 new oil platforms would be built between 2020 and 2030. Well, they don't know that. And the platforms are not their platforms, but actually platforms of the oil companies, because this is a company that actually works with the oil companies to help them explore. They don't produce oil themselves. So when they say 5 new oil platforms would be built, what they're saying is that they think that in this scenario, in this landscape, one of the positive things about a landscape like this would be that we can expect some new building, some new platforms to be built. And then they could, so some of these things can be quantified, but they're assumptions, right? Then what you want to do is, if you've figured out roughly what the scenarios look and feel like as business environments for you, then you want to say, well, what would be the key issues that we would have to deal with? Now, a key issue is there are positive key issues and they're less positive issues, right? So the positive issues, we call them opportunities, and every scenario, even if it looks pretty tough, will offer some opportunities for you to do something which will improve your competitiveness in that scenario, right? And if you can see it in advance, which is what this whole exercise is about, then you can make some preparatory moves. You can get ready for it now. So what you want to do is you want to identify in each of the scenarios some opportunities that you believe would materialize, but also challenges, because that's also these will also preoccupy you, obviously. And then the most logical thing in the world is, if you've identified opportunities and also challenges that you believe you would have to deal with in each of these 4 scenarios, then you would want to try to come up with what your strategic response should be. How would you prepare for this scenario? Now, the word response is a little bit, maybe that's not the best choice of word, actually, because response means kind of waiting around and then responding to the scenario as it develops, or when you see that it has developed. And what we're really talking about here is responding to this pre-knowledge that a scenario might develop along these lines. And so what you want to do is you want to kind of come up with some strategic initiatives, with some innovations, perhaps with some ideas for how you would actually, what you would actually want to implement in that scenario, which would improve your chances of business success. Now, if any of you have ever put together a business strategy, and I'm guessing that almost everyone in the room has, I have in my time, you know how much work that is, and nobody wants to do 4 strategies. So this is not a case of saying you need a full-blown 100-page strategic document for 4 different scenarios that might materialize. No, I think what you need to do is you need to have a kind of a to-do list, which would basically say, if this is the scenario that would materialize, here are 3 or 4 things that we would probably need to do. We would need to, and they might be things like, we would need to invest in more salespeople, for example, because it's going to be a boom scenario. So we need to be better at marketing and sales, or we need to build a new factory producing more of our widgets or something like that. So the will need to do is not necessarily a detailed strategy, but it's got some notions of the strategic actions that you could take that would make sense for those scenarios. So coming back to our oil and gas company, basically what they saw was that there were certain issues that they would be facing, opportunities or risks, and that for each one, they wrote down what they thought would be a strategic response that would make sense. And that strategic response means, plan for it now, get ready now. And what they did, which I'm not showing here, I don't believe it's part of one of my slides, but they actually said, okay, if this would be the case, and this would be our strategic response, let's just take number 3 as an example, enter into more strategic alliances. Well, they could also then say, all right, who would be in charge of that project? Okay, and they name someone. And they would say, what would that person's budget be? And they actually say, okay, we would be willing to invest X in this project. What would be the milestones that we would expect? Well, by 6 months from now, we would expect to have identified 3 target companies that we would like to form strategic alliances with. And 12 months from now, we would expect that we would have actually signed contracts with them. And then, so basically, it's kind of a bit of an operational roadmap that would help you to see how you would actually get done the things that you think would be strategically important for you in those scenarios. It doesn't mean that you start doing them yet. It just means that you have your roadmap in the drawer ready to go. The 7th step of the process, I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's nice to give the scenarios names because no one remembers what scenario 2 actually was about. But if you give it a sort of a snappy name, and I like to use the name of songs, for example, then later on, it's easier to remember what that scenario might have meant. So these are just a couple of silly examples. And then lastly, what you want to do is you want to bear in mind that a scenario develops over time. It's wonderful, or it would be wonderful if you would wake up one morning and the newspaper would actually announce to you which one of the four scenarios is now going to be reality. But this is not, this doesn't happen in real life. Instead, what you need to do is you need to understand what signposts or what indicators might be out there in the environment that would give you a signal that we're moving in the direction of one of these scenarios as opposed to one of the others. Now, what can be a signpost? Well, almost anything really. And some of them will be very clear signposts. For example, if a new law is passed mandating a particular action that is only set out in one of the scenarios and not in one of the other three, in the other three, then obviously that's a signpost for that to happen. So now, please. Yes, is there a question? No, okay, sorry. Now what I want to do very quickly is, in just a couple of minutes, is to show you how you would apply this process to you in the new normal landscape that we're trying to visualize after the coronavirus crisis phase is over. So remember, the first thing we would do is we would start with our pest model. And I've just put a few things down here. These are not obviously related specifically to your bank or to any particular company, but just some examples of some things that would potentially make a difference in a post-coronavirus world for a typical company. And when you sit down to do this exercise, what you want to do is you want to think specifically about the things from these four categories that would have an impact on you, on your future success in the new world. Now, let me just take two of these just to show you how they might play out. I've chosen the first one, the U.S. election. Now, why that? Because you're in Zimbabwe, and the U.S. election is far away and doesn't have an impact on you. And I would argue that the U.S. election in any 4-year time, any time that there's a U.S. election of a new president, it does have an impact on the world. Probably this one might have more of an impact on the world than a lot of past elections, because Trump is a very polarizing president on the one hand. He also has done a lot of things to in terms of relations with the rest of the world. So the influence that the next election, could have on the world, including Zimbabwe, could be quite serious. And then the other one, of course, has to do with the crisis itself. Will the crisis turn out to have been short and sharp? In other words, we get out of it pretty quickly, or does it go on for a long time, and the hardship that we're having to deal with actually is something that we are still dealing with for the next, say, couple of years? If we turn those two contrasts into a matrix and we end up with 4 scenarios, here's what they could be. Now, again, this is not specific to Zimbabwe. It's not specific to banking. It's not specific to microfinance at all. But in terms of just an example that would help you understand how you could put some meat on the bones of a scenario matrix like this, this will give you, I hope, some ideas as to how it works. So in the first scenario, you would have the re-election of President Trump, who, as a Republican, is pro-business, and usually the election of a Republican president in the U.S. is gives the stock markets and the business community a lot of confidence. Now, if you also have a situation where the crisis is over by the time the election happens, then you might actually see a very quick recovery and everything kind of getting back to where it was before relatively quickly. So possibly even ushering in a decade of roaring 20s growth. All right. The second scenario is also the re-election of Donald Trump. But when he's re-elected, the crisis is not over. So it continues to go on. And so a lot of the bans, a lot of the measures that have been put in place by companies will still be in place. And the financial markets are not going to take off like the boom years that you see in scenario number one. But we'll have basically a kind of an extended period similar to what we're in now. Now, what happens if we have a long crisis, but Trump is not reelected? And I put here Democratic candidate. Of course, everybody knows that should be Joe Biden. But just between you, me, and the lamppost, I'm thinking that Joe Biden will probably not end up being the candidate for all kinds of reasons, which we can go into another time. But basically, assuming that whoever the Democratic candidate would be would have very similar policies, just be as a Democrat, then if the Democrat wins and the crisis goes on, then a very common way for the Democrat mindset to attack this kind of problem is basically government stimulus spending. You'd have maybe a coronavirus tax, but in the meantime, because of the severity of the crisis, you'll have things like airlines and hotels going out of business. And the more you put in place a kind of a heavy tax and spend regime, the more the dollar can actually sink in value. And the financial markets, of course, would be hit as well. Lastly, if the crisis is over when the election comes about, but then the election goes to the Democrat, it's very possible that things were kind of looking good, like a recovery appeared to be taking shape after the crisis was over. But then comes the election, and you have the election of somebody who is not typically not a business a backer, and so you end up with this kind of the old 1-2. So a second hit would affect the economy in 2021 when the new administration comes into office. So now, this matrix that you see here, one of the objectives, and I think this is true of most scenario planning, is to be a little bit provocative. It's to show you how things could develop. Remember, you're trying to posit the idea that the outcomes could be extreme rather than in the gray zone in between. So that's why we said it's either going to be short and sharp or it's going to be long and severe. Now, there's no in between Donald Trump and a Democrat candidate. It's either, you either are going to get one or the other. So there's no gray zone there. But the point is that the scenarios, in order to be contrasting, they are going to purposely show extremes. And sometimes those extremes can be a little bit provocative, but that's okay, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get open people's eyes, wake them up, make them see, oh my goodness, is this really possible? And get them to sort of scratch their head and think, well, yes, actually, this is possible. If this were to come about, this is kind of the world that we would find ourselves in. So forget about this particular matrix, but think a little bit about what a matrix like this would be for you in the bank. And my advice to you would be to try to make these four scenarios a little bit thought-provoking. Not just to try to predict what they would be like, but to show what they really could be like in terms of challenges that you would face. And of course, then once you've done that, you would talk about specific opportunities, specific challenges, and then your to-do list, right? So that's the end of my presentation. I see it's 11. I hope that you might be able to stick around for a few minutes to ask me questions if you have any, because I'd be very happy at this stage now to take any questions that you have. Let me go back to this. There we are. And please, if anybody has anything that you'd like to ask me, I'm here for you.
Thanks, Woody. Please make me host and we will go to questions and answers.
Don't be shy. Hello. Yes, please. Sure.
Yeah, with this presentation from Woody, any questions or comments?
Mandas. Yes, there you are.
Yeah, I was just going to say this is so invaluable. I really appreciated this.
Good.
You told us not to take notes, but I was taking notes.
Okay.
Shame on you, huh? But that's okay.
I was just wondering, it would have been nice if you could do us, if we'd done it kind of a dummy scenario planning for, not necessarily for the Women's Bank, but for the financial sector in an environment like Zimbabwe. But this is so, I just wanted to comment that this is so exciting. I was just typing and talking to Johnson. I hope he can pass my request to you. It can't come here, but I passed on something to Johnson. I have to rush for another meeting, but my team is on. Please proceed. Can we get something tangible out of this? Something that you can do pro bono for the Women's Bank. I know you can.
I don't know about that, but we will chat, Doc. We will chat, certainly.
We'll certainly continue this conversation and try to come up with something valuable for you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Yeah, so my team will be on. I just need to join another meeting, but let's get questions coming in.
Thank you very much for your participation.
All right. Thanks for attending anyway, and good luck for your next meeting. Yes,
thank you.
We will get in touch.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Don't forget to turn off your mute before you ask something. Everyone's muted, I see.
Unmute.
Can I ask one simple question?
Please.
When you look at these contrasts, what kind of contrasts do you put on your scenario planning relating to COVID directly?
I'm not sure I really understand the question. Is it how much contrast are you looking for when you actually choose these endpoints, or what is your question?
I'm saying, what do you see as the endpoints in the area of COVID, one way or the other?
Oh, in the area of COVID. Oh, well, there would be several, I would think. One example would be, of course, as you saw, just in the last example, one example would be whether or not the COVID crisis period is something that we managed to emerge from quickly, or whether we're still dealing with it, a couple of years from now. Now, what could affect that? One could be, for example, whether or not there is a vaccine. So you could say, will there be a vaccine in the next 12 months? Just picking that arbitrarily. Will there be a vaccine? Yes, no. Obviously, if the answer is yes, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the whole world is vaccinated, but it just does mean that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and that it's just a question of time then before everybody is vaccinated, immunized, whatever. If the answer is no, then we have a different world. So I think that now this has to do with COVID itself, and not necessarily with any particular business. But you could imagine. Let me take. I probably should dive into microfinance, but I just don't know it well enough to give you something that I think would be a good example, because you would all kind of snicker at my ignorance here. But let's just take an example of a company that had its supply chains disrupted because of COVID. So it was importing some of its raw materials or some products from, let's say, from China, as an example. And so obviously this has been disrupted in the last 6 months. Then the contrast could be whether or not they find, in a reasonable amount of time, they find substitute suppliers, or they don't. Or it could be, will we return to our Chinese suppliers, or will we? No, actually, I'm sorry. When I say will we return, that's a strategic decision. That's not a scenario. The scenario is not about what you will do. The scenario is about happens, and then what you do is about responding to the scenario. So I'm sorry, I misspoke there. But you might say, will the Chinese suppliers get back up on their feet? Yes or no? If the answer would be yes, then we have a strategic decision to make. Do we want to use them or not? So it's a two-step issue there. Well, I hope I could go on, but I think you get the idea that COVID has affected so many businesses in so many ways, not even businesses, but schools and the healthcare business and everything, that it's not so hard to find a contrasting outcome in how things could actually turn out based on strictly on the COVID for a specific industry or a specific company.
I think it's very helpful. I was thinking also in the area of non-COVID changing paradigm in the way we do business as an issue.
Yes, well, that is exactly, the changing paradigm is another way of saying exactly what this is all about, which is to determine what the new normal, which is the new paradigm, would be when this is behind us. There are certainly companies that won't experience much in the way of change, but just take as an example, if you're a university. So there's an example of an organization, and depending on the country, some universities actually operate as private businesses. They have to make money, and suddenly one of the big questions that they're dealing with now is, are any students coming back in September? The new academic year, and they don't know. They don't know if they're going to have an incoming first year student class that's tiny or hardly existing, and yet they're already forced to make the decision now about whether they will open up and how. And you see some schools who are saying, well, we're going 100% online, but we're not going to reduce our tuition fee. So, what do you do about that? Well, possibly, okay, so that's a strategic decision that they've made based on, I assume they've done some scenario planning, I hope, and they've made the decision to leave tuition fees unchanged, even though they're going to be changing the mode of teaching. And of course, then what might happen is they might find that was actually a very bad strategic decision, because parents might say, well, wait a minute here, why are we paying all this money for Junior to sit in the basement and do his courses online? That doesn't make sense. So maybe this would be a good time for you to take a year off and do something, get a job or do something practical, travel even. But this is not the time to be investing in, of course, investing in education is always good. But I mean, this is maybe not the year where it makes sense to do it in this way. Johnson? Yeah. Johnson, you are muted. Yeah.
Any other questions, comments?
Well, when you receive the recording, you'll see the final slide has our email addresses. And so if there are any questions, be happy to answer them. Just send me an email or through Johnson. And I realize that not everybody thinks of the perfect question on the spot, and they always have a tendency to come, 2 hours after. So I'm here for you. I'd be very happy to continue to work with you as well. And I hope that we can make something happen. It would be great. And in the meantime, if there's anything that you is on your mind about how the process works or something you didn't understand, please just let me know, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
So, sorry, I have one other.
Yes, please, David.
Yes. My other question is that this scenario planning is actually based on the efficacy of the plans themselves and how we analyze the assumptions. How can you build into the system an area where these decisions and assumptions could actually be haywire? They would be wrong.
Well, yeah, the sad thing is that any company can make bad decisions at any time, right? So scenario planning doesn't necessarily prevent you from making bad decisions, but it does give you a greater array of possible environments in which a decision would be made. Let me give you an example. Supposing you in your business, there was really only one variable that made any difference as to your future success. But as of today, you don't know whether that variable is going to be sort of switched on or switched off, and yet everything depends on that. And let's just also further stipulate that you won't actually know whether this variable is on or off until maybe, let's say, 3 years from now. But you're the CEO. What do you do today? Well, I don't think you would just sit around and wait for 3 years to see what the outcome will be. Wouldn't you probably make a plan for the on and another plan for the off, right? And then you would not necessarily implement one or the other of these plans unless you could implement parts of the plan in preparation, and it wouldn't matter because you could flexibly jump from one to the other. But the decision that you make is based on an understanding that there's more than one outcome out there, rather than what a lot of business leaders conventionally, if you look at the way things used to be in the very top-down structures of the past, you'd have a business leader who would say, I know where we're going and I know where things are headed and I have a vision, follow me. And off he goes and expects everybody to just follow him or her. And that's potential recipe for disaster if the vision doesn't match reality. So I think a better leadership attitude, and this makes scenario planning a leadership tool, is to say, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I, as your leader, I don't know how the future is going to pan out. I don't know it any more than any of you. And since I don't know, then doesn't it make sense for all of us to sit down together and try to figure out what is realistically possible, and then we will make plans based on that understanding. And I think you'd get greater buy-in from your team if that was the way you thought about things. And of course, the plans, if you have alternative plans for the alternative futures, then when you begin to see, this is the signpost idea I was talking about, when you begin to see that, oh yeah, it looks like we're going in this way rather than in this way, then you open up the drawer and you've got your plan for that particular scenario, and you say, okay, let's make this happen. And we've already thought about who we would put in charge, how much money we would invest, etc.
Victor, any comment?
What I've done, Ms. Manyakara, is I've sent Woody a message in the system.
Oh.
Yeah, that's where I put my comment. Sorry.
Oh yes, I see here. We'll review the recording.
Yeah.
I see. Yes. Okay. Very good.
Is this something that can be discussed, or that's for later?
Well, yeah. Look, nothing that warrants, I think, the attention of the team. But all I mentioned was, I think it's a useful presentation, and that one being unfamiliar with scenario planning in this kind of technical detail would obviously want to review that presentation and then try and relate to our own strategic planning processes, and maybe raise issues with you guys once that has been done.
Yeah, okay. No, thanks, Victor.
Sure. Look forward to continuing the conversation with you about that.
Thank you.
Presumably, your comment also applies to back home.
Yeah, sure.
CMAS is one thing, but there's also, the home turf.
Exactly. So it's two organizations I have in mind there.
Okay. No, thanks very much. We'll take that up with you later.
Good.
Anything else?
Clara, you're very quiet down there. I see your name. Are you there?
That's Clara.
She's muted, I think.
Yes. If you're speaking to us, we don't hear you. You need to unmute yourself. No, maybe she's not there.
Hello.
Oh, there you are. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Pleasure.
Very, very enlightening.
Good. I'm glad. Had you ever seen this before? You knew about scenario planning previously?
Not in such great detail.
Right.
Because this one forces you to really think and do a proper comparatives of scenario and projections.
That's right.
So it actually forces you to start thinking.
That's all. That's a good thing, don't you believe?
Yeah, very good indeed.
Yes,
Very
absolutely.
And thinking creatively, hopefully, because that's really the catch, like David was saying, you know. David, I think, wanted something that will give the correct answer, but this is about our creative juices being put to test.
That's exactly right, Johnson. Because, you know, one of the things that attracted me to scenario planning in the first place a few years ago was that it represented this very attractive blend of structure and logic, but with creativity. So the logic actually tells you, you know, you use logic in the first part of the process to get your matrix, right? And then when you've got a matrix and you say, okay, what would the 4 scenarios be? You've got the skeleton, but to put meat on those bones, that's where your imagination is called for, right? So if you're experienced, obviously, you may have seen a scenario like that in the past, or you would be able to say, I can imagine that, you know, if we were in this scenario, such and such would probably be true, and this might happen, and that might be the case based on my experience. And also introducing a creative element there, because you're trying to imagine the world as it might be, but not as it is. And that was, I just found that really, really exciting. And you are, I don't think I made this point very clearly, but it is okay in scenarios to be a little bit to over the top, you know. So I did a scenario for the travel industry not long ago, and I talked about 45 airlines being bankrupt, and you know, I'm just kind of inventing things. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give people a little bit of a slap to get them to think, oh my goodness, this is terrible, but is it realistic? Yes, actually, it is possible. So it's not, you're not trying to be pessimistic or optimistic. You're just trying to say, well, in this scenario, here are some things that we might possibly have to deal with.
No, true. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you for being with us.
All right.
See you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Clara.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
David, as you're the last of the Mohicans here, I'll just say thank you for being part of this. We really appreciate having your input and your questions. And if there's something I can do for you afterwards, you know, to something a little bit tailored for your business, I'd be happy to discuss that with you.
No, definitely I will come back to you if there is need, but this was really, really helpful.
Great.
Because there's no doubt that everyone is at a crossroads right now.
Yes.
And it is to get out of the crossroads, which is key. But thank you for the presentation. I found it fantastic.